Chapter 4, Skin and Body Membranes. So the body membranes cover the linings and cavities of the body organs and form some protective layer around the organs and the skin. So they fall into two major categories. The first type is epithelial membranes, and the second type is connective tissue membranes. Now, the epithelial membranes can be divided into three types. The first one is the cutaneous membrane. Now, the cutaneous membrane is your skin. And the second type is mucous membrane. So the mucous membrane lines all the organs that open up to the exterior of the body, like the upper respiratory tract, the oral cavity has mucous membranes, and the urogenital region has mucous membranes. And the third type is the serous membrane. The serous membranes are sticky fluid-like regions that line the body cavities that do not open up to the exterior of the body. And the second type of membrane is the connective tissue membrane. And the connective tissue membrane is represented by synovial membranes, especially at the joints of the body. So the first type of membrane is the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin. The cutaneous membrane is composed of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. So this is the type of epithelium we talked about, and they are stratified, meaning they're present in layers. Now, this type of membrane is just on the skin, so it is exposed to the air. Now, the second type of membrane is the mucous membrane. The mucous membrane is present in the organs that open up to the external environment. For example, the nasal cavity, the mucosa of the mouth or the oral cavity, the esophagus lining. All of these have mucous membranes in them. The third type of membrane is the serous membrane. Now, serous membrane is composed of a simple squamous epithelial lining, and they also contain a very thin layer of areolar tissue. If you remember, areolar tissue is made up of elastic fibers and collagen fiber. And then in contrast to mucous membrane, which open to the external environment, and the serous membrane that line body cavities, the serous membrane are also closed to the exterior environment. Okay, so the serous membrane basically line the parietal layers of the organs. Parietal layers is the external-most layer of the organ. For example, the parietal layer of the heart is the outermost layer of the heart, which aligns the body, the cavity surrounding the heart. And the cavity surrounding the heart is a serous membrane, which contain a serous fluid to prevent the heart from friction. And the visceral layer of the heart is the innermost membrane of the serous membrane that attaches to the heart and keeps the heart in place. All right. So pleural membrane is the membrane surrounding the lungs. Pericardial membrane is the membrane surrounding the heart. Peritoneal membrane is the membrane surrounding the visceral peritoneum, which is the intestinal or digestive tract. So this is the parietal pleura, which protects the heart, and this is the visceral pleura, that's the innermost membrane that keeps the heart from rubbing onto other organs. And anything that says pleural cavity has to do with the lungs, and anything that says pericardial has to do with the heart. And the peritoneal cavity is the cavity that lines the digestive tract or intestine. Now, this chapter will mainly consist of the skin, which makes up the integumentary system. The integumentary system is the largest system of the body, and it forms a really thick protective layer to protect the underlying organs. So the skin is made up of three major regions. The first one is the epidermis. The epidermis is the superficial region. So the region you see on the outside is the epidermis. The next region is the dermis, which is the middle region. And the third region is the hypodermis, which is the deepest region of the skin. The first region, which is the epidermis, consists of 4 to 5 layers of stratified, squamous, epithelial cells, and they form the outermost layer. So the epidermis is basically just a layer of dead cells. The dermis, or the middle region, contains connective tissue and free nerve endings, which act as the sensory receptor. And the third region, or third layer of the skin, known as the hypodermis, is the deepest layer of the skin. And here the skin is rich in blood vessels. Basically, the region in between the dermis and the hypodermis is full of blood vessels. So if you've heard of hypodermal needles, this is the region they aim for. And the hypodermis is full of adipose tissue, which is nothing but fat cells. So these fat cells protect our internal organs from cooling too much or heating too much. So they provide a thick layer of protection. Now, if you take a closer look at the structure of the integumentary system, the topmost layer is the epidermis. This is just a layer of dead cell. And this lining over here is the basal lamina, or the basement membrane. And the next layer is the dermis. The dermis can be divided into the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And the third layer is the hypodermis. And the hypodermis is just a big layer of fat underlying the other two layers of the skin. So the papillary layer is the upper layer of the dermis, and this is where they have some indentations, and they contain something called a scapulary loop, which furnish nutrients to the epidermis. And then you also have pain receptors and touch receptors in this area. So on the palms and hands of the soles and feet, you have something called as papillae that are arranged in a peculiar pattern that increase friction and help us grip a surface. Now, the ridges of the fingertips are well provided with sweat pores and leave unique identifying films of sweat known as fingerprints. And the fingerprints are basically made up by these ridges in the papillary layer. And that's how we get our fingerprints. Now, the reticular layer, on the other hand, is a deeper layer which is rich in blood vessels, sweat, and oil glands, and they contain deep pressure receptors known as lamellar corpuscles. So these lamellar corpuscles basically help in detecting any change in external pressure. And this region also contains cells of the immune system like phagocytes that prevent bacterial infection in case you get a cut or a wound. Now, this whole layer of dermis is rich in collagen and elastic fibers. So it's rich in areolar connective tissue that you took a look at the other day in the lab. The hypodermis is the bottommost layer of the skin, and it contains a lot of adipose tissue. They help in providing a layer of protection, and they help in maintaining insulation in the body. So these adipocytes are very, very important in preventing our body from any shock. So if you take a closer look at the structure of the skin or the integumentary system, now the plantar region or the edge of the feet or the surface of the skin, they all look similar in microscope. However, the stratum corneum, or the outermost dead layer of cells, is really, really thick at the bottom of the foot. So this picture shows the main structural features of epidermis, and the epidermis consists of 3 layers of cells. The first layer is known as stratum corneum. So stratum corneum is just a layer of dead cells, and these are just dead simple squamous cells, and they only contain a flat membranous sac which is filled with keratin, and they also contain glycolipids in the extracellular space. So they basically make our skin waterproof, and we shed about 8 kilograms of stratum corneum in a year. So a lot of dust in the air is basically stratum corneum. Now the next region in the skin is stratum granulosum. So stratum granulosum are flattened cells that are not completely deteriorated, but they are about to die off pretty soon. So they also contain cytoplasm, which is the body of the cell, and they are full of little granules because they contain deteriorated cell organelles. Now the next structure is stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is a thick bundle of intermediate filaments which is filled with keratin. Now keratin is the main protein that makes our skin waterproof. So it's in the stratum spinosum that you contain pre-keratinized cells. So as they move up the surface, the keratinocytes get really, really active, and keratin covers the skin surface in the stratum corneum. Now the bottommost layer is stratum basale. Stratum basale contains really actively dividing cells and some newly formed cells which eventually will move up the stratum corneum and form a layer of dead cell. But an important feature of stratum basale is that they contain melanocytes that produce melanin, and they contain a lot of melanin granules. The melanocytes basically give you the skin color and help your skin from sun damage. So people who have a lot of melanin in their skin, they are less likely to get skin cancer because melanocytes do a very good job of protecting people from skin cancer. So that doesn't mean that people with darker skin do not get sunburned. It just means that they are less likely to get skin cancer because the skin cells do a very good job of repairing any damage in DNA. Now in the stratum basale, there is also something called as the sensory nerve ending, known as Merkel. Oops, that doesn't write well. Merkel disc. So the Merkel discs are the sensory receptors in the skin that help us sense change in pressure. So the Merkel disc help in detecting any change in pressure. So again, I'd like to talk about the papillary layer, which contains some important nerve endings especially. They contain capillary loops that provide nutrition and oxygen to the cells in the integumentary system, and they also contain something known as Meissner's corpuscles. So these corpuscles are sensory receptors that respond to touch and really low frequency vibration, and we also have free nerve endings in this region known as Merkel's disc. And the Merkel disc are the structures or sensory nerve endings that act as respond to very, very light touch. So they are pressure receptors. So they're known as Merkel discs. So these are two important sensory nerves present in the papillary layer of the skin. Now this is just another picture of the structure of the skin along with the appendages or the additional structures that make up the skin. So the skin, as we discussed, helps in preventing water loss, helps in defending against pathogen because the skin contains a lot of macrophages, which are the cells of the immune system. They also contain glands that oil the skin, and they contain glands that cool down the skin. So the integumentary system contains some important appendages that you need to know of. Appendages meaning attachment. And appendages of the skin include the sweat glands, which help in cooling the body. So the sweat glands are present in the dermal layer of the skin, and they produce clear secretions, which is mostly water and nitrogenous waste. So in older people, when the kidney fails, the sweat glands pick up the function and they smell they smell like basically urea, and that's because the eccrine sweat glands pick up the function of the kidney and they end up secreting a lot of nitrogenous waste through sweat glands. So they play an important role in removing metabolic waste from the body, and the process of evaporation of sweat helps in cooling down the body. So sweat glands are important. Now the other important glands in the skin are the sebaceous glands or the oil glands. So these are the oil glands which produce oil and lubricates the skin and hair. And the third important appendage in the skin is the hair follicle. All of us have some tiny little hair structure, and the hair follicle is a structure that has a root sheath and a fibrous sheath. So there are two things that make up the hair follicle: the root sheath and the fibrous sheath around the hair follicle. Now the hair follicle is the region right above the hair root where the hair originates. And if you look at the hair shaft itself, the hair shaft is the region of hair present above the skin. So the shaft is what you see over the skin surface. So the hair itself is an epithelial structure which consists of a root which is buried in the skin and the shaft that you see on the surface of the skin. And yeah, so some important nerve structures that you need to know of is the sensory nerve fibers and the two important pressure receptors, which are the Meissner's corpuscles and the Merkel disc that are present on the surface of the skin. Okay. So this picture just shows a cross section of the duct. So if you see that ducts are usually lined by cuboidal epithelial cells, and this hollow space in the center of the duct of secretory cells in the skin are the lumen of the ducts where the cell can secrete substances. So the hair consists of 3 layers, which is the squamous keratinocytes, which is the epithelial tissue that surrounds the hair, and it contains the cuticle, which is the outermost layer, a cortex, and the medulla that is surrounded by the hair follicle. And the hair follicle contains certain receptors known as arrector pili or pili. And the arrector pili are the smooth muscles attached to the hair follicle. And when you get really cold, the arrector pili are the ones that are responsible for goosebumps. So these smooth muscles contract involuntarily and cause the hairs to stand, resulting in goosebumps. Now the next important structure of the integumentary system is the structure of the nail. The nail is a modified layer of epidermis, and the nail consists of the nail matrix, the nail bed, the hypoconium, the hyponychium, and the eponychium. So the eponychium is basically the cuticle of the nail, and the little white region above the cuticle of the nail is known as the lunule, and everything else is the body of the nail, and this is just the free edge of the nail. So this is basically a dead layer of cells. So if you cut your nails off, they can grow back up. So a nail is just the modified layer of stratified epithelial tissue, mainly that consists of stratum corneum, which is a dead layer of cells. So in the nail matrix, we don't have any blood vessels, but as you go deeper in the bed of the nail, they contain blood vessels, and that's why you can bleed easily when you cut too deep into the nails. So the main functions of the integumentary system include chemical protection. They act as a chemical barrier. So these the low pH secretion from the sebaceous glands help in lowering the pH of the skin, and at this low pH a lot of bacteria cannot sustain. So this low pH provides a chemical barrier on the skin and prevents our skin from infection. Now when this chemical barrier gets disrupted is when people have fungal infection and yeast infection, which is very common in the urogenital region. So when you take a lot of medication and when you're really stressed, women are prone to have yeast infection in the urogenital region. That is because the pH gets disrupted. It also acts as a physical and mechanical barrier. Like we discussed before, it's a thick layer of keratinocytes which are rich in keratin and glycolipids. So this makes the skin hydrophobic or water fearing. So it makes a waterproof barrier to the underlying layers and to the outside environment. It also acts as a biological barrier because it contains macrophages. Macrophages are basically white blood cells that engulf antigens in the environment. And some other functions of the skin include body temperature regulation. Now the blood vessels in the skin, they dilate when we are really hot, and increase sweat gland activity to cool the body at elevated temperature. Now they also help in sensing temperature, touch, and pain. Specifically, the receptors known as Merkel disc and Meissner's corpuscle help in sensing really low vibrations in the environment, thereby helping us sense touch and pain. Now, some other functions that we have discussed include metabolic functions that help in eliminating waste from the body. But another important function of the integumentary system is to synthesize vitamin D precursor. Now, the vitamin D precursor, you can say, is actually synthesized in the kidney, and it is transported to the skin where it sits, and in the presence of sunlight, it gets changed into a vitamin D precursor, which is later converted into vitamin D. And that's why sunlight is really, really important. It is also a reservoir of up to 5% of the blood volume, because it constantly helps in regulating the body temperature. Again, it helps in excretion of especially nitrogenous waste in older adults. When the kidney fail, the skin plays a very, very important role in eliminating nitrogenous waste and salt. Now, there are some types of carcinoma that you need to know of, which are associated with the skin. The first one is the basal cell carcinoma. This is the least malignant and most common. It appears red, shiny, and as a raised nodule. And in the basal cell carcinoma, basically, as the name suggests, the basal cells proliferate and slowly invade the dermis and the hypodermis, and it can be cured by surgical incision. So basal cell carcinoma results due to excessive multiplication of the basal cells. Now, the squamous cell carcinoma involves keratinocytes of the stratum spinosum, and this is the second most common type of carcinoma. And in this, the cells appear flat and scaly, and this also can be treated by radiation therapy or removed surgically if the prognosis is good. And this is what a squamous cell carcinoma looks like. But by far the most dangerous type of carcinoma is melanoma. In this, it actually looks like the spot on the skin looks like a mole, which begins like a mole, but then it begins spreading, and it spreads in an uneven shape. So if you see a mole that looks unevenly spread and it continues to grow, you might want to get it checked out. And the melanoma actually can develop from pre-existing moles. The melanocytes in the skin in general do a very good job in repairing any DNA damage due to sun rays in the skin. And of course, this is the most dangerous type, so it is highly metastatic, meaning it can spread easily to other parts of the body, and it is highly resistant to chemotherapy. So it is treated by usually a combination of surgical incision and immunotherapy as well. Now, the characteristics of melanoma that you need to watch out for is asymmetry. The two sides of pigment area do not match. So some regions of the melanoma are more pigmented than the other. And then you have border exhibitions or indentations. And then the color is really, really black or brown or tan, sometimes even reddish or blue. So it overall looks unevenly spread. And then the diameter continues to grow, and it's usually larger than the 6 millimeter, which is the size of a pencil eraser. So if you have a mole that looks bigger than that, you might want to get it checked out. So the biopsy can usually tell you whether it's a melanoma or not. So this is called the ABCD rule. So this is what a melanoma might look like. It's uneven with uneven edges and uneven coloration, and it's larger than 6 millimeter. Now, the next thing that you need to know is the different types of burn on the skin. There are several different types of burn. You have a 1st degree burn, 2nd degree burn, and a 3rd degree burn. Now, the 1st degree burn injures the epidermis, and it's more superficial, like a sunburn. So you don't see any blistering in a 1st degree burn. Now, the 2nd degree burn injures the epidermis, and the superficial layer of the dermis. So in the second degree burn, you see a lot of blistering. And the third degree burns by far are the most severe type of burns, and they cause extreme damage to the hypodermis. So a lot of times a third degree burn destroys the sensory receptors of the hypodermis as well. So the third degree burn is the most severe. It destroys the epidermis, dermis, and some of the hypodermis, along with all of the sensory receptors in the dermis. So these are some important topics that we have covered and that you must know for your quiz this week. So I'm hoping you watch this video before you take the quiz. Thank you. Bye bye. I'll see you next Monday.